be looking at here, but it's a really neat way to see stars and understand how we construct this really important diagram that's very helpful for understanding the lives of stars. So I'd like to just start out with this. There's some captions here.
This is a Hubble Space Telescope image of the crowded core of the globular cluster Omega Centauri. The brilliant colors of the stars are real. They correspond to stellar temperatures. They can also be used to trace stellar evolution. Astronomers like to know how blue the blue stars are and how red the red stars are. So we'll first sort these stars out by color, blue on the left and red on the right. Next, we'll sort the stars according to brightness, the brightest stars at the top and the faint stars at the bottom. The final plot you see represents different stages of evolution of stars. Stars spend most of their lifetime burning on the main sequence. When the fuel starts to run out, they expand to become red giants. They find a new source of fuel, helium, and burn blue hot. But even that runs out. They end up burning out as white dwarfs. Based on images for the Hubble Space Telescope, we've assembled a true plot that is a snapshot of the life history of stars in this ancient cluster.
Okay, so you can see how this diagram that we're going to talk about now, how it gets created. That's a really nice way of visualizing how we sort the stars. So what you saw in the little movie there is that they were looking at a specific cluster of stars. And what I mean by that cluster is that all those stars were at about the same distance from us because they're all part of an actual group of stars that form together. And so their brightness is essentially the same as their luminosity because they are all at the same distance. But in order to make this diagram, which is known as the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram after the two astronomers who first developed it, we need to know the distances of stars so that we can determine their luminosity. You have to know how bright the stars really are, and the luminosity is then plotted along the y-axis. Now, what do we plot on the x-axis? That's going to be the temperature. So the most important thing for you to remember from this slide is that an HR diagram plots the luminosity of stars versus their temperature. And these are two of the things that we're talking about determining for stars in this chapter. Now, you can imagine how exciting it would be if you were to say, I'm just going to plot different quantities, different values I've calculated for a whole bunch of stars. I'm going to plot one thing versus another thing and see if there's any trend, if there's any relationship. And if you made a plot of two things that aren't related, then you would imagine that the stars would just kind of be randomly distributed around in space. But what Hertzsprung and Russell found is when they plotted luminosity of a star versus its temperature, that stars fall in a very distinct region of this diagram. They're not all over the place.
Remember, luminosity is brightness.
I mean, there are some stars in different parts of the diagram, but most of them lie along this thing called the main sequence. In fact, 90% of all stars, including our own sun, are on this thing called the main sequence. Now, when I say they're on the main sequence, that doesn't mean that they're in some specific place, right? The stars are just where they are in the sky. But what I mean is that in terms of their luminosity and temperature, they lie along a specific locus in that frame of reference. Now, what's happening? Why are all stars sitting along the main sequence, or why are the vast majority of them along the main sequence? Well, what that's really telling us is that stars are, when they are along this kind of line through this diagram, that they are currently burning hydrogen in their cores, what we call their hydrogen burning phase. And in the next chapter, we're going to be talking a lot more about stellar evolution. And you'll find that a diagram like this is extremely helpful in plotting out or kind of following a star's stellar evolution, because all stars will be on this main sequence when they're burning hydrogen in their cores. And that's what the sun's doing right now, so it's on the main sequence. So stars will have a very specific temperature and luminosity while they're burning their hydrogen in the core. Now, so that tells you right away some of these other locations.
Important point about hydrogen burning in the core and being on the same cluster or main sequence.
Mean they must not be burning hydrogen in the core anymore, and you'd be right about that. And we'll be going into all those details in the next following chapters. And you'll see words like giants and dwarfs. Again, that's primarily telling you about the size. Because remember that from Stefan's law, we know there's a relationship between the size of a star, its radius, and the luminosity and the temperature. And I just told you that the Hertzsprung-Russell diagram is a plot of what? Luminosity versus temperature. So that means that star sizes are along different lines on this diagram. So what you see from this figure is that here is where stars that are the size of the sun would have to be on this diagram. And so you can see that a star like the sun, it's got to be on this line in order to satisfy Stefan's law. So a star that has the sun's radius, if it has this temperature, it's going to be at this luminosity. Now on this diagram you'll see that the luminosity is in solar units. So the sun's luminosity is going to be at 1. These would be stars that are 10 times brighter, 100, 1,000. Again, this is a logarithmic scale, so we're going up every time by a factor of 10.